From the darkness he fashioned a huge and awful thing, a creature that none of the tribe had seen before, even in the mushroom of their sleeps. It had long, curving claws and horns all down its spine, and cavernous, yawning, jagged jaws, and these jaws folded down over the she-bear's shadow. Cthulhu, the surf dragon, that comes when the foam is blood red from a baby girl that gnaws the middle from all the bears, black, brown, or white, and leaves behind the empty pelts. And then here, he kept on before the old woman could overcome her shock, is Akura, the double-headed water omp, who walks the ocean bottom upright like a man and never sleeps, one head awake by day, the other by night. And here is Tagalala, she who watches around corners with eyes on stalks and has poison in her steps like the centipede. And here is Payu, the pool crawler, whose face is rotting entrails and whose outbreathing spawns maggots and whose inbreathing sucks the hearts from little boys that would be men but do not have the power. One after the other, these monsters and demons and krakens left from the shadow wall to the floor, where they began to dance around the fire pit, each stalking each other. The thunder boomed along, and the rain hissed, and after a horrible battle amid the shadows, the surf dragon at last arose victorious. This monster then began circling the longhouse, eyeing the maidens, and saying, "I chewed the heart from the bear and the bones from the elk. Now I am full and happy. Which one of you maidens will lie with me tonight? Who might tonight? Who might tonight?" To one maiden after the other, the dragon sang this, but they all turned away in terror. Finally, the thing reached young Shoola. The shadow jaws lifted in a huge smile, and the fingers spread. With a cry, Eemook jumped up and seized a digging stick to attack, only to become entangled in his own twisted limbs and stumble and roll helplessly at the feet of the swaying monster. Eemook covered his face, certain he was about to be sucked empty. But the stranger raised his hand and with his 3 middle fingers touched the pearly rim of the shell hanging around his neck. At once the huge creature shrunk back to a tiny frog that peeped in fright as it hopped comically across the floor and back up on the wall. The frog shadow covered its face with its hands as Eemook had done and peeped pitifully. The children squealed with delight. Relieved, everyone in the longhouse applauded the shadow play and mimicked Eemook's terrified rolling on the floor. All the men puffed and nodded, and the women laughed and pointed with their and plucked at their sides, even Shoola. By this time the stew in the chieftain's pot was done. The chief dipped out a bowl, making sure to get the biggest piece of meat, and handed this bowl to Shoola. "Give this to our guest," he told the girl, "for it is clear to me that he is not only a great chief, but a powerful shaman as well. Our longhouse is honored by his presence." As she handed the tall stranger the food, he smiled into her face. When Eemook saw how she smiled back at the stranger, he felt the basket of his life go empty. Heartbroken, the crippled spoonmaker slunk back to his corner on his hands and knees. There he found his grandmother behind the shadow screen. She was rocking back and forth on her heels, humming the chant that old people sing when they are ready to take the last walk to the cliffs. "Why is it you that sings the song of your ending, my grandmother?" the boy asked with a sob. "It is my middle that has been gnawed away, not yours. It is my seasons that have been emptied, not yours. Why do you wish to end your life?" "When the house stinks and the chimney is clogged," she said, "it is usually time to get out of the house." The storm passed and the longhouse grew very still. It was near dawn. The fire pit had burned very low and the shadows were long. After the excitement, everyone was sleeping deeply. The longhouse was so still it half seemed empty. Eemook had not slept all night. Careful not to awaken his grandmother from her muttering dreams, the young man arose and he pulled on his ragged deerskin clothes, and he began to creep toward the door with his walking sticks, his sack over his shoulder. He undid the lashes and crept from the longhouse toward the cliffs. The sea dozed quietly between the tides. The full moon strove to part the last of the storm clouds, and some stars could be seen. An owl swooped near Eemook's head and perched in the hemlock, calling. Eemook knew the meaning of that owl's call. Yes, soft bird of the night, Eemook answered. You may sing the song of my end. I have no heart left to do it myself. So the kind owl sang as Eemook stepped to the big cliff's edge. The boy closed his eyes and wrapped his arms about his carving, waiting for the owl to finish. But just then, he heard another sound, and on the beach down the small cliff, he saw something. And the sound he heard was not like something made by beast, nor man, nor spirit, but something struggling between all three. Eemook opened his eyes, and he beheld a fearful sight. There on the beach lay all the tribe's maidens, tumbled on the sand in sodden heaps, like piles of wet rags. No wonder the longhouse had seemed half empty. All the maidens. The only girl still dry was Shoola. She was walking across the moonlight sand with her skirt tucked high. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead like a babe's, spellbound by the lamplight. But this light hung around the neck of a dripping hulk that wallowed in the ocean's edge, another monster, and bigger even than the surf dragon. This thing was the size of a young killer whale, and hairy. And to Eemook's horror, he saw that Shoola was crossing the sand to straddle it for a monstrous ride in the waves. This was why the other girls were nearly drowned. With a shout of rage, Eemook tumbled down the sandstone steps, heedless of his deformed limbs. His only weapon was his curved rib. He slashed and hacked, but the blows seemed only to amuse the behemoth. Laughing, it reared full upright, taller than any man. When it stood, its hairy mane fell away. As Eemook gaped, the monster turned into a man. It was the stranger, standing naked, save for the shell glowing about his neck. The stranger laughed louder as the boy continued to strike at it. The blows veered away as against an unseen current. Then the stranger touched his fingers to the shell and spoke a word, and Eemook's beautiful carved bones sprang apart into all the little animals he had so lovingly carved. But they no longer behaved like family. Growling and gnashing their teeth, shaking their talons and clacking their beaks, these bone-white replicas advanced on their creator. Eemook swung at them with a walking stick. Then the stranger touched the shell again and spoke another word, this time to the girl. Immediately she spun around to join the attack on her friend, hissing and scratching like a mad mink. And once again Eemook had to retreat in humiliation, scrambling on all fours back up the cliff with his family of animals and his lifelong friend snarling at his crippled heels, and the strangers bellowing his awful laughter at his back. The young man ran scrambling into the forest until he could run no farther, and fell among the dripping salal bushes. As he gasped for air, the moon came down and shined into his eyes, which were going sharp and narrow, like the eyes of Urvek when she is angry. In the longhouse all was still with the approach of dawn. The maidens were tucked again in their family robes as though they had never moved. The stranger was sleeping near the fire pit. The men were snoring in ignorance. Only the old grandmother was awake. She had stirred herself up early in the light and was braiding a cedar bark noose for herself. It would be a thoughtless thing to taint a useful line. She was about to begin anew her song of ending when she heard from afar off a harsh drumming and singing. She hushed and listened, puzzled. The sound came closer and closer. Finally, it burst through the door into the longhouse, making a great din. It was Eemook, and he was beating his wooden walking sticks together as he hobbled in, and he was singing. Then here is the finish, he sang. Here it is, at last, at last. Here is the potlatch. Here is the leveler, the toadstool on the carrion, the new grass on the grave. Come high and low, come full and empty. Here is the potlatch for one and all. And he flung his crutches into the fire pit. Sparks leaped to the roof, and the fire began to blaze up. Eemook seemed to stand straighter. He tottered to his corner, where he caught up his bow drill and his carving stone. He clapped them together and sang, "And here are my tools, my third and fourth hands, into the fire pit and gone for good." A puff of flame welcomed the tools. Eemook then dragged forth his collection bags. He shook and rattled them, singing, "Then here are my spoons, spoons, spoons that were to be, spoons for men and women all, into the fire pit and gone for good." By this time, the people were all awake and crying out that he reconsider. They needed spoons for the winter ahead. "Stop, Toad," said old Um-Lalagic, the chief. "You cannot do this." But Eemook flung his sacks into the fire. "What is this commotion?" the golden-haired stranger demanded, sitting up on his robe. "This crippled fool is trying to declare potlatch," the chief explained in an angry voice. "But it means nothing. Only he who has a great gift to sacrifice can do such a thing. Stop, fool. You waste your goods." The young man pushed the chief aside and continued flinging his treasures into the fire. "Then here is the pine knot beaver with the real beaver teeth for the scraping of bowls, and the drinking duck with the agates for eyes, dishes and cups and platters and hands, into the fire and into the fire and into the fire. And see, there is no other man like Eemook. There is no other man like me." Once more the chief cried for the young man to desist, but it was too late. The carvings being burned were indeed beautiful, and the spirit was stirred. With a cry, another young man accepted the challenge and pulled his fish spear from the soft earth and threw it after Eemook's treasures. Then a netsman cast his net as though to snare the leaping flames. Then the chief's own brother set fire to his feathered drum and beat it while it burned, shouting, "Then here it is, then here it is, then here is potlatch, here is the leveling. There is no chief, there is no slave." Soon all the men were dancing about the firelight, each trying to beat his neighbor's sacrifice. With a groan, the chief removed his headdress and sadly placed it on the rising fire. "We must do it now," he explained to the stranger, "or the No Thing will be angry with us. It is our law." The stranger reluctantly removed his peaked headdress and followed the chief's lead. The chief threw in his doe-skin boots, and the stranger did the same. The drums pounded, the fire leaped. Finally, all the men were dancing and singing in the firelight, naked, and all the women were weeping and rubbing sand in their hair in grief at the loss of so many prized possessions. Then the chief noticed that the stranger had not removed the magnificent shell amulet about his neck. "You must throw in the necklace," he said. "You must throw in everything." The stranger stopped dancing. "I will not," he said. "It is a trick on me by that cripple. I must not sacrifice my necklace." All the men stopped dancing and looked at their chief and at the big visitor. The fire showed the anger in their faces. Some of them began to take up boiling stones. "You must," the chief told him, "or we must throw you from the cliffs. It is the law." "I will not," the stranger said again, "and I shall not. And I am more powerful than your law." And he spoke a word, and he touched the shell with his fingers. And from the shadows flickering against the walls came once again the army of dark demons, shrieking furiously and waving their claws. The tribesmen fell back in fear, but Eemook rushed to the pit and drew out a blazing spear. He thrust it into the surf dragon, and the creature squealed with pain. "They are made of nothing but shadows," he called to his tribesmen. "Drive them into the light." Grabbing up burning brands, the tribe charged the demon army, driving them out of the longhouse and into the dawn. One after the other, they melted in the light. Only the stranger was left when they reached the high cliff's edge. With stones and torches, they forced him to the edge and then over and into the rushing tide below. With a roar of rage, he disappeared beneath the waves, only to surface moments later in his true form as the hairy-maned lion of the sea. The shell necklace was still around his huge neck as he swam toward the horizon.